I leave the floor now to Professor Lynn Frewer. She's a professor of Food and Science Society at the School of Agriculture, Food and Rural Development in Newcastle University in the UK. We have former chairs in food safety and consumer behavior at Wageningen in the Netherlands. And you have been working with the Institute of Food Research, UK. And you have your PhD in applied psychology from the University of Leeds. I have also looked at part of your impressive list of publications, and we have some very interesting recent publications on consumer attitudes, science, and public health. So, Lynn, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you. How do I get the presentation?
I'll just put up to you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organisers for asking me to come and speak to you today. This is a very beautiful place. By remarkable coincidence, we live deep in the countryside. My next door neighbour sails tor ships, and yesterday the tor ship sailed from Northumberland to Gothenburg, and I'm kind of wishing I'd hitched a lift with him rather than fly Galen, but never mind. So I'm here, you asked me to talk about attitudes and consumer perception about additives. I'm going to go back a few years just to try and look at how attitudes have changed and perhaps contextualise additives in view of some of the emerging and pressing issues which are having a big impact on the security of our food supply. So I think the questions we need to ask: whom do additives benefit? In the past, the emphasis perhaps was on benefit to the food industry, whether that's economic or in terms of other priorities, or the food security of the planet, and that, of course, reflects some of the attitudes as a food consumer, how are those attitudes changing. We also see the evolution of a food consumer who is interested in health, in improved security through system resilience, through a whole range of other factors. And I think it's probably a mistake to think about one food consumer. We have a whole range of food consumers with different underlying attitudes, beliefs, and preferences. So I'm just going to start off to summarise some of the differences between expert and consumer perceptions of risk associated with all sorts of technologies, but agri-food in particular. Experts within their domain of expertise typically rely on technical risk estimates. They use scientific argumentation, which does not take account of socio-economic impacts of either implementing or not implementing a technology. In theory, they balance risk against benefits. But, for example, in European regulation, even though I'm British, I can still talk about Europe because we haven't Brexited yet, how socio-economic benefits or even technical benefits are embedded in regulatory processes. We've seen this with the GM debate. I think we're seeing it with other areas of technological innovation, for example, nanotechnology. I'll come back to that later. The public, and I would say quite rationally, use their risk perceptions to make judgments about risk. They also make assessments of benefit. Although many people don't understand the technology underlying a smartphone, they still use it. It's a technology that's reached saturation point in Northern Europe at least. This requires risk communication to take account of the people's concerns, their ethical values, the other kind of values which are important to them, as well as technical risk estimates. And emotional or affective responses are also important because we use emotion as a cue to decide whether something is good or bad. We do it all the time, because we can't always, in psychological terms, process large amounts of information about the risk world in which we live. Otherwise, none of us would ever cross the road. Here's some very old data from some colleagues from 1999. And I like this slide. It's the results of a consumer survey where people were asked in the UK to rate different risks, different food-related risks, and then factor analysis was applied to link the different risks to their psychological concerns. And what we see here is that the very technological types of risk, GM foods, hormone residues, BSE, were perceived to be highly unfamiliar but also highly feared. So people do not like these sorts of hazards, and I don't think this has really changed over the years. Up here, highly familiar, not feared hazards, saturated fats and sugar, perceived to be familiar, are not frightening at all. Perhaps this is why so many public health campaigns associated with food fail, because people aren't worried about these, and they're very, very familiar risks. And the additives were kind of in the middle, moderately unfamiliar, moderately fearful, but not at one of those two extremes. So, a quick summary of risk perception and how that relates to different kinds of food hazard. If a risk is perceived to be involuntary, people perceive they have no control over exposure, it's much more threatening than one people choose to take. So unlabelled food additives would be an example of that type of hazard, as would exposure to milk contaminated by melamine. Potentially catastrophic risks concern people most. The classical example would be the BSE outbreak, but potentially food additives, particularly if they're there because of fraud or some kind of criminal activity. Unnatural or technological risks are more threatening than natural ones. Food additives are perceived to be unnatural quite a lot of the time, although this depends on the hazard. And ethical representations and concerns are really quite an important determinant of consumer decision making. Certainly in most of Europe at the moment, we're seeing the emergence of a group of people who are very, very worried about food waste and food security. And I'll come back to that later, because that might be something that turns the tides on this negative embedding of food additives. Finally, I suppose this is something that's becoming much more important, particularly as technologies roll out into LMIC countries, the equity of distribution of benefits of risks of technological innovation. How do we make sure that all of the population has access to beneficial innovation? So let's just run through that list linked to food additives. People will look at a food additive, ask, are there any personal benefits? Are there benefits to the society in general? These might be related to health, but also economic or environmental benefits. The issue of differential accruement of risks and benefits. Is it industry that benefits from any technological innovation, including food additives? Ethical concerns, fraud, lack of consumer autonomy. I do a lot of research looking at consumer perceptions of food fraud in countries like China or Southeast Asia. And because the types of fraud are very dangerous, melamine is the one that we all know. There's recently been a lot of cases of plastic rice entering the food system and people getting sick but not dying from that. Other food fraud, olive oil, which is contaminated with toxic additives to make it appear more robust. People are very worried in these communities about fraud, particularly linked to some of these dodgy additives that are going into the system, which then casts a negative light on other additives. And I'll come back to that as well. Perceived personal risk, of course, is important. Additives have been linked to bad behaviour in children, with a mixed evidence base, I would say. Perceived societal risks, the efficacy of the regulatory framework, Do we trust regulators? What about regulating on the basis of hazard rather than risk? How do people here think about that? And the idea that recalls must be perceived to be efficient. So I would argue that it's better to recall under conditions of uncertainty if there's a risk in the food supply chain than to just go along and say it's okay. So here's an example of a signal that something was going wrong. Sudan 1 was recalled globally in 2005. The interesting thing is that Sudan 1, it's linked to an increased risk of cancer, but it's quite a low level. So this is where we're looking at the hazard-risk distinction. It's legal for use in many parts of the world, but not in Europe. It entered the UK food supply chain through Premier Foods, using it to make a Worcester sauce, which was then used in other products. So it ended up in around 350 food products. The UK Food Standards Agency issued a warning advising people not to eat the products, but said there was no need to panic because of the very, very low risk. So again, actually what we're looking at is hazard rather than risk. It's not permitted, as I've said, in the UK, Europe and Australasia, but it's legal in other parts of the world. So this actually then produced a message that all food additives are potentially dangerous, as well as caused problems in the debate about standards, European standards versus standards in other parts of the world. The actual risk, I would say, is still uncertain. We know it's a hazard, but in terms of risk, there's some ambiguity there. And the way people think about these types of incidents is that one incident or a close category of incidents signals that all chemicals and additives are bad. It's the way people simplify the world around them. If we go to 2007, this hit the headlines: tantrum-linked additives in 132 new products. Health experts described the findings as worrying and called for the removal of unnecessary additives in all new food and drink products. Fergus Lowe got quite a lot of media attention. It's common sense that if food and drink additives pose any risk at all to a child's health, they should not be used. And 6 particular additives were, I suppose, selected as being the worst in terms of children's behaviour. And here's just some of the pages that we've found on the internet, which are still available. I'm not sure, I couldn't find empirical evidence to suggest that this link was very strong for all of these products. If anybody else has this evidence, it'd be great if you could tell me. I think tartrazine, I found something, and that was it, really. Incidents of chemical contamination are also linked perceptually to food additives. So the history of dioxins in the environment, there's been a series of contamination incidents from the 1930s onwards. The big one was in Belgium in 1999. A lot of uncertainty still about the human health effects, I guess, from the perceptual side and also from the biomonitoring side. The issue is that dioxin bioaccumulates up the food chain. It also ends up concentrated in fat tissue. These are the 3 big incidents. The first one resulted in a massive economic catastrophe for the Belgian food industry. I remember being in Belgium at that time, and the only thing I could find to eat the crisps imported from outside of Belgium. So it's a very unhealthy time for me. The Ireland pig supply chain incident was very well handled, I think. So there was dioxin contamination. The Irish Food Standards Agency instituted an immediate recall of all the potentially contaminated products. There wasn't economic loss, but trust. Trust in the food industry remained high. And a moderately well-handled incident in Germany in 2011, where in fact the incident didn't become transparent immediately, so that did result in some distrust. But the point is, dioxin is a chemical, and so are food additives. So this is more information that's being aggregated to demonstrate that food additives are bad for health. Here's some research we're currently conducted in Southeast Asia. And here we're looking at the views of experts about the use of additives and sweeteners in drinks. We have a campus in Singapore. That's our research hub out there. These data were collected in Malaysia. Obesity is becoming very problematic in the Southeast Asian region. And I think the BMI recommendations are much lower as well compared to Northern Europeans, because people are just naturally smaller. So what we wanted to do was find out what Malaysian experts, the opinion leaders in nutrition and industry, thought about the use of artificial sweeteners. And the reason is a lot of the calorific intake is coming from soft fizzy drinks, which is having a major impact on the health of children. And that was the sample, the Malaysian sample. We drew experts from food science, nutrition, health communicators. So really those people that in Malaysia would be informing the media, would also be designing public health campaigns. So I apologise, there's a small error in the labelling on here. But this are people's ratings on the extent to which artificial sweeteners in food and beverage products is beneficial for human health. This is an aggregate of the food and beverage, because we ask these questions separately. So this is the rating for sugar. This is the rating for natural sweeteners such as stevia. And this is the rating for artificial sweeteners such as aspartame. You see that the food scientists thought that the artificial sweeteners were relatively unbeneficial compared to the other sweeteners, particularly the natural sweetener. And it's a similar pattern for the nutritionist and the health communicators. Okay, so we have a similar effect for beneficial for human health. This is the interesting one, harmful. So sugar was regarded as being fairly harmful by food scientists, by nutritionists, by health communicators. The natural sweeteners were regarded as being pretty good, relatively, but the artificial sweeteners were regarded as being very negative, in particular by the food scientists. And that surprised me. But basically, if these people are driving the types of risk communication in the area, in that region, I can see that some of the obesity problems are not going to go away. We've seen a similar pattern of expert views in South Korea and Indonesia, all of which are experiencing sudden changes in health. So quickly to summarize, respondents perceived natural intense sweetness as the least harmful compared to sugar and artificial intense sweeteners. Artificial intense sweeteners were the most harmful. Sorry, I've got that. Yes, that's right. Except for health communicators. I don't think that this is really going to help health in the region at all. We've also found that additives, particularly in Southeast Asia, are ranked as the most negative of all the potential food hazards that people can be exposed to. I'm going to move on now to food waste, because although I've given you some kind of negative consumer messages, I'm going to turn the tables now. So this is some data from Gustafsson, some estimates about the amount of food loss and food waste in the global food supply. Globally, the estimate, I'm not quite sure where they got these figures from, to be honest, there's a lot of assumptions here. But globally, the estimate is about 10% is wasted. And you can see how that breaks down across different food types. So perhaps using additives as a food preservative is something that's going to be regarded as a positive use of additives by consumers. We know fairly reliably that in the UK, consumer waste represents about 30% of the food supply. It exists throughout the food supply system, retailer behaviours, partly linked to this rejection of non-uniform food and vegetables in supermarkets, and there's a lot of campaigns to reverse that. And things like the 2-for-1 offers. I was in a supermarket and I bought a bag of oranges, and the person at the cash desk said, "There's a 2 for 3 on this, why don't you get 2 and you can get 1 free?" And I said, "I don't want this. They said, I'm not going to eat 3 bags of oranges," and they thought I was crazy. Really, why would anyone not do that? So this is some work by some colleagues of mine in my research group, Matt Granger and Gav Stewart. And they use machine-learned systems models, or Bayesian networks, to investigate the interlinkages between different databases, which they can then link up. And this is actually a pilot study from a European project called Refresh, where they linked up existing Eurobarometer data on food waste with some compositional analysis in England and Wales, including some objective measures of food waste. And they used R to apply Bayesian network analysis. And of course, the thing about machine learning is it's always a worry that it'll make people like me redundant, because you won't need theory anymore. But the idea is that this will provide the most parsimonious structure of interlinkages between different drivers of an activity. So this is the Bayesian network for UK food waste. I'm just going to summarise the findings for you, because there are some policy problems in interpreting these data. That's just an example of the drivers of EU food waste. I'm going to move on to the summary.
Lynn, please try and raise the mic. Something happens.
Is that better?
No, the battery is flat, so then could you hand over yours? Yes.
This works.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that's much better. So, the highlight findings: young people waste more than people over 65, families waste more than single people, students waste more than people in other employment, people with more frequent rubbish collection waste more, but gender and community, rural, semi-urban or urban, it makes very little difference to food waste. What you can't do is force people to live in smaller family units. I would not want to be the UK minister that says we're going to reduce rubbish collection. Young people, we can target them with information and specifically intervene. But the way supermarkets sell food militates against being able to prepare small portions of food, because it's packed in big portions. People like to pay less for more. So there are some policy problems there. Home composting does reduce food waste, but not everybody has a garden. And I really wouldn't want a home composter in my house. This is the big thing with children. Fussy eaters and discarding whole meals associated with families leads to greater food waste. So, much against my own interests, I would argue that simply getting people to change their behaviour without introducing other technological innovations into reducing food waste is going to be problematic. There are also some policy conflicts. What we're finding through more qualitative work is that there's a collision between food safety and sustainability and reduced waste. If people are keeping food longer, they're storing it longer in the domestic environment. Microbiological contamination might be an issue, and also the growth of aflatoxins. Additional communication might be required about the benefits of appropriate food storage and preparation practices. I mean, if I'm told that I'm keeping food longer and that this is potentially carcinogenic, and I was looking after small children, I think I would waste the food, even though the symptoms on the food might not be there. We're also finding that older people who are more prone to problems with foodborne illness are getting sick. So, there's a policy conflict there. So, the question that I have here is whether consumers will revisit food additives, which are preservatives, to reduce food waste and keep food longer. I'd say partly it depends on the effectiveness of risk-benefit communication, but also perhaps better preservation, technological innovation is going to deliver improved foods. If we just think about risk communication, this is the results of a systematic review looking at risk-benefit communication about food. The first thing is that most communication about food additives and food technology in general has been about the risks. There's less about the benefits. Food issues tend to be of greater interest to researchers and research sponsors, depending on what's happened. So there was a huge amount of information after the Sudan 1 incident, but generally people aren't that interested in many of these issues. But risk communication does need to focus on the concerns of the target population, the contents of the information, how accurate it is, and without trust in the information source, you may as well not bother with one or two, because people won't read it. So that's important, but it's an imprecise science. So looking at technological interventions, which are available to improve shelf life of foods, we can change the food to increase shelf life or processing qualities, GM food additives. We can use nanotechnologies, for example, nanosilver, which I count as a food additive, or nanofilters to increase shelf life. We can use novel preservation techniques, food irradiation or pulsed electric fields, or some of these smart fridges and ICT in the home. We're trying to work with our computer science department to develop platforms which are much more accessible to the elderly, for example. This smart fridge looks wonderful. It's kind of an iPad on a fridge, only very large. It costs about 3,000 or 4,000 euros. So it's not affordable by many. But there are other approaches, ICT projections that look like a recipe book, which can be used to give people the right cues or encourage them to maintain the contents of their fridge in line with some of these food waste issues. But new technologies will only reduce food waste if they're accepted by consumers. So I'm going to look a little bit now at nanofoods. Again, to me, many of the nano-encapsulation type activities, which might have benefits in terms of taste, production, or preservation, nutrient delivery, delivery of antimicrobials, perhaps not these agricultural applications, but they all come under the banner of novel food additives. So, some thoughts about technology adoption. These are some protests against the use of nanotechnology. I'll have to say this one wasn't about food, it was about nano-clothing. particularly silver in socks, which stops them smelling. But actually, there hasn't been that much protest about nanotechnology in the food supply or outside of it. So again, we asked experts what will determine the societal acceptance of nanotechnology. These are experts taken from all over the world. So Singapore, the UK, the Netherlands. And we got people to come up with the issues that they thought would be of concern to consumers and then rate how important they are. I won't go through the methods here, but I do want to highlight the results. So what the experts thought was that the encapsulation and delivery of nutrients in food packaging, these types of applications would be the ones where there was most concern, that consumers would worry about this. There would be some social benefits, but not as many as compared to, for example, targeted drug delivery. So the experts were saying, we don't think these additives are going to be accepted by consumers. Although the conclusions focused on this idea of perceived need on the part of consumers, they thought that foods in particular would be linked to societal risk and concerns about the physical proximity of the application to the end use, particularly if it's swallowed, taken into the body. And it wasn't seen to be a priority development. Let's see what the consumers said. So repeating the experiment with consumers. Actually, it's a totally unexpected result. So you have food packaging, nutrient delivery. People are saying personal benefits are linked with these applications, they're necessary, they're important. Lack of need was right down here with RIFID tags, smart dust for military use. So somehow the experts, and they were drawn from all sorts of spheres of influence, were thinking that the consumers would be much more negative about the technology applied to food than they actually were. And I think this is a kind of reaction from GM when that was introduced, particularly in Europe, where it was introduced in a way that didn't consider consumer views, but also benefits to consumers. So I've said this quite a lot, I presented this to industry, and I still get the same reaction. We don't think that this is a good idea. Well, I disagree. I don't think it's an issue. What about giving people some information about technology used in food? Is that going to be a problem? So what this shows is negative through to positive attitudes about nanotechnology. And that's the extent to which people are certain about their attitude. So from low to high. And these are the results after people have been given information. And what happened here was that some people just picked up the risk information and became more negative. Some people became more positive. They picked up the positive aspects of the technology. There's a whole bunch of people here in the middle who became more certain that they didn't care. It wasn't an issue. So they were very ambivalent. They'll adopt the technology if they see a benefit to them, but to be honest, it's not a problem. It doesn't represent something that they're going to be on social media discussing. So group one became more negative. The majority in terms of the overall sample, 46%, didn't change, but became more ambivalent. And 12%, who tended to be male, highly educated, very young or very old, became more positive. I suppose the issue here, though, is that if you're worried about the impacts of nanosilver as an antimicrobial on the environment, it doesn't matter if you don't choose to buy that food because it's going to be the environment anyway. However, if you really, really want the benefits of that technology to you, then you want the choice. So there's a kind of clash there between different sectors of the public. Looking at other applications, we know some have failed. Food irradiation will never really be accepted in Europe except for a few spices and medical applications. We think, or I think, food technology, particularly from the additives, the functional side, is going to be very positive. If it can also contribute to the reduction in food waste, that will also be something that consumers are beginning to want. There's some technologies like pulsed electric fuel technology, nobody knows about it, nobody cares. So it really isn't a societal issue. I keep on coming back to this point that communication must address consumer concerns as well as technical risk estimates. One thing that's often forgotten is the economic functioning of households. Certainly at the moment, post-Brexit, food prices are increasing. The UK is very food insecure. Prices are going up. The pound is going down relative to other currencies. Some of these marginal households have problems keeping afloat. So again, the use of acceptable additives to preserve food, to extend shelf life, to perhaps at the same time deliver improved nutrition, is, I think, going to be perceived to be rather positive. So I'll come to the end now. Thinking about the farm-to-fork approach, with additives, as with other technological innovations, I think it's important to assure the equity of access to innovation for all consumers. If we want to ensure quality of life, public health, it's important that we don't cost these technologies out of people's pockets. In parallel to this, we're doing some work in China looking at access to precision agriculture for small family farms, because at the moment they are being priced out by the big farms. And it's important to the Chinese government that they have access. I think this applies to all food technologies. I also think that, by and large, for beneficial food additives, that's a technology which will not price out of pocket for most consumers. Risk-benefit communication, we need to get that right. We know from the past how not to do it. We need to understand people's values and their concerns. I think we need to discuss the distinction between hazard and risk a lot more effectively, because we're not doing that at the moment. I'd also say a lot of the discussion about additives has focused on hazard rather than risk, and that's enshrined in the legislation. If we come back to our Malaysian experts, they were firmly convinced that artificial sweeteners were bad, and our other experts in the area of nanotechnology who were convinced that consumers didn't want additives derived from nanoencapsulation, for example, whereas people actually did. So perhaps it's no good asking experts. Don't ask me. So we need to make sure that we harness food technologies to improve publicly acceptable public health policies. We're confronting a huge array of problems associated with food security at the moment. Too much salt and sugar on one hand, obesity, chronic food shortages in other parts of the world, malnutrition. I think food additives have a major part to play, not only in reducing food waste, but also improving the functionality of food through delivery of microencapsulated functional ingredients. Perhaps, I haven't talked about it, but this could also link in to personalised nutrition and genetic analysis of people's nutritional requirements, and we can use encapsulation to try and deliver to those people those nutrients that they really need. Let's try and develop interventions to make reduced food waste choices, the easy ones. As I've said, this may not just reflect consumer behaviour. Perhaps if we make food safer longer, that's also going to be an advantage. We don't want people getting sick through food safety issues. I haven't really gone into this, but I think consumer inputs into technologies need to occur right through the food chain to make sure that what happens here, what's delivered in here, is in line with consumer preferences. So it's no good developing a wonderful new additive that people are going to be frightened of and which doesn't deliver a desirable benefit to consumers. So that brings in a whole raft of activities linked to knowledge exchange and public participation regarding food technology innovation processes. And of course we need to simultaneously tackle societal and environmental drivers across the entire food chain. That includes consumer behaviours. We can't lose them. I think in the past, technologies have just delivered a good, and so people have been told it's wonderful, which is why so many products have entered the valley of death. I think it's about 5% of new food innovations actually become commercially viable because consumers haven't been asked what they want from those technologies. It's my final slide. Using food additives to improve food security. There may be policy conflict between reduced waste and food safety or optimal nutrition. I think we can harness additives in various forms, nanomaterials, other additives, preservatives, to reduce some of those policy conflicts. Policies must consider both technological innovation and consumer behaviour. Technological innovations are acceptable to consumers if their design and outcomes align with their priorities. Concerns need to be addressed as part of innovation trajectories. Ethical and emotional issues need to be considered, but so do economic factors. Price, it's becoming very, very important in terms of particularly marginal households, and social structures, access to food. We need to communicate about the benefits and the risks of food additives. If those risks are very uncertain, we need to communicate about that too. And this idea of co-production, getting consumers involved at the early stages of food design is important. Each consumer is located in a different social environment. This needs to be taken into account as part of the process of technological innovation, addressing food additives and their purpose as well as other innovations. We need to contextualise this by the things that are important to consumers. Health and waste. I'm not convinced industrial competitiveness is close to the consumer's heart, although we realise that the economy of a country is also dependent on that. So I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for a very extensive and interesting presentation. My question is, have we underestimated the public, the consumer, in regards of food additives and how they look upon them? Because what you are saying is that, when I listen to you, that we should involve the consumer more in working with food and developing new products and adopting new technologies.
I think yes. I mean, we do need to involve the public. I also think, I'm rather disturbed by the views of the experts that just assume the public will reject technologies, whereas that when you actually collect the data from the public, it's a different pattern. And I think the assumption is that the public will react in the same way as they did to GM, in relation to all other technologies, whether they're food additives or some other innovation. And I don't think that's the case. So we really need to do a bit of research to find out what people really want.
And what seems, at the first glance, being a very irrational behavior is actually very rational from the consumer's point of view.
Yes, I mean, if there's no benefit to me, why would I change my behavior to accept something? So I think benefit is at the core of all of these innovation processes, but we also need to understand how consumers perceive benefit. What is it they want from this? And some of these emerging issues, this concern about the security of the food supply, I think are becoming an increasingly important driver in the future.
So when in doubt, it's better to take a rope for a snake than a snake for a rope.
I'm going to say yes, but I don't understand that.
Well, it's a question of survival.
All right.